Hello again, and today I want to talk about some advice that could potentially save you millions in real estate. And, everyone has got these key sayings that they believe if you stick to that, you'll do really well. But I want to talk about a couple of things in particular. And one of them is that I think you should never be the first to name a figure when it comes to negotiations. And it's so tempting when we're buying anything, a secondhand car or a piece of furniture at a garage sale or something like that. It's always, well, will you accept $20 for this? Or if it's a car, will you accept, $50,000, something like that? Depends on what the car is, whether it's a good price, of course. And my belief is that the first person to name a figure, in generally, always loses. You should never be the first to name a figure, because you might think, wow, I think it's worth $50,000. So if I offer that and get it for that, I think it's a good price. But you don't know what the seller thinks it's worth. What if they think it's only worth $30,000? And if instead you say to them, well, I'm interested in it, what would be the minimum price that you take? What if they came back and said $30,000? You'd probably say, yes, okay, done deal. And you would have saved $20,000. Or you might even say, $30,000, that's ridiculous for that old dump. I don't think it's worth a penny over $20,000, but I'm happy to give you $22,000 to try, So that's called haggling, right? You could try and negotiate the price at that point, and your ability as a haggler will be determined by how persuasive you are and how they perceive your desperation to be and how you perceive their desperation to be. But in general, the first person to name a figure will lose. Now, will it always work? No, because if you say, well, I think it's worth $50,000, just like there'll be instances where they were or would have been happy to accept $30,000, there might be someone else who says, no, I'm not going to let it go for a penny under $80,000. And if you're not willing to spend more than, say, $60,000, then you'll never bridge that gap, and therefore the deal won't be done. And that's okay. That happens a lot. But in general, we find that there is this wide discrepancy. So I'll show you an exercise that I did for years when I ran an event called the Property Investor Score. I still run them from time to time. It's not a pitch for that. But what I would do is I would divide the room up into two groups. And one group would be the buyers and one group would be the sellers. And I'd talk to them separately so that the buyers couldn't hear what I said to the sellers and the sellers couldn't hear what I said to the buyers. And I'd say to the buyers, all right, you're looking at buying a property and you really, really want this property. In fact, you want it so much that you promised your spouse that you will get it for them as a wedding anniversary present. So you're so keen on this that you're willing to go up to $900,000. And they'd ask me, well, what kind of a house it is? How many bedrooms does it have? Does it have a swimming pool? You name it. I'd say, listen, it doesn't matter. It's a house. You really, really wanted it. You want it. You promised your spouse you'd get it. And if push comes to shove, you'll go up to $900,000. So, okay, put them aside. And then I went to the sellers and I said, listen, guys, you really need to sell this house. You've got other things that have come up and you are kind of desperate to make the sale. And in that context, in order to make the sale, you are willing to drop the price and you are willing to go as low as $325,000 just to get the deal across the line. You promised your spouse that you would get rid of this so that you can do whatever else you were going to do, have your vacation or something. So I set it up that way. And then I said to the entire room, I said, all right, buyers, I want you to find a seller, find a buyer, partner up and start negotiating. Well, I gave them a time limit. It would vary depending on the size of the room and the size of the crowd. But let's say it's 4 minutes. And I'd say, all right, 2 minutes gone, 3 minutes gone. All right, 30 seconds to go. If you can't agree on a price, then you don't do a deal. And I don't know or care to share you yet whether there are any consequences of that. Anyway, most people ended up doing a deal. And then I'd pick these pairings, these couples at random. And I said, okay, what did you do the deal at? $638,000. I say, cool. What did you do it at? $780,000. What did you do it at? $890,000. What did you do that at? $900,000. Well, I can guarantee you, the people who sold their house for $338,000, when they hear someone else for that same deal, remember, they all got the same information. They sold it for $900,000. They're thinking, man, I missed out on nearly $600,000. Conversely, those people that let it go for $350,000, $370,000, When they heard that someone else was willing to pay $890,000 or $900,000, they were ropeable. And it wasn't a prize for whoever sold it for the most or whoever bought it for the least. The realization here is that even if we don't know what color the house is, whether there are flowers in the flower pots in front of the windows or anything, that's all I told them. It's a house. You're willing to pay up to $900. You're willing to accept down to $325. The disparity of prices was huge. And when we sat down and analyzed it, we spent an hour or two doing this. It's actually a lot of fun. When we analyzed this, it was so interesting because what it boiled down to is the person who named the figure first tended to lose. If they say, well, I kind of really want this, I'm willing to pay $600 for it, that means the seller already knows that $600 is the minimum he'll get. He's revealing that so he would say, no, I need at least $800 or I'm not going to sell it. All right, my partner told me it's no deal unless you get at least $800. And so because he knows he's willing to pay $900, he'll go up. Whereas, so it just goes to show you've got to think very carefully. Let the other person decide what they want to do first. So I've got another example, which I think is worth sharing, and it has to do with a funeral parlor. Some of you are a bit queasy about a funeral parlor and what goes on in there. They process bodies there and prepare them for burial or cremation, basically. So it's not always a pretty thought what goes on, why they have stainless steel benches in there and what the formaldehyde is used for. But anyway, I came across this vacant funeral building. Some of you know the story, and I don't want to emphasize what I did to get a tenant for it. But, it was vacant. It had been on the market for 3 years. Therefore, the price was suitably suppressed. I did not buy it because if I bought a vacant building in the hope that I could find a funeral director for it, that's all good and well, unless I can't find a funeral director. And then I'm stuck with the same problem that the sellers were stuck with. So I didn't want to buy it until I had a tenant. How did I get a tenant? I employed someone at the princely sum of $8 an hour to go around calling every funeral director further and further away from this location until she found someone who said, yes, I'm interested in that. So it took 2 days. At the end of 2 days, she got me on the phone and said, listen, this guy's really interested. Pardon me. And I got him on the line and I said, listen, there's a vacant funeral parlor in this location. Why don't you go and check it out and see if you like it? If you like it, full disclosure, I don't own it yet. And if you want to buy it, you can buy it. Why did I say that? I knew that in all probability, he didn't want to buy this thing. He was interested in running funerals. And so I've never lost a building because I had a potential tenant there. And I told him that I don't own it yet. It's for sale. If you're interested, buy it. Most aren't into that game. And if it ever happens, so be it. I just don't want to buy a building before I have a tenant. But he said, no, I don't understand the real estate game. I know how to run funerals. I would want someone to buy it for me and I'll lease it from him. I said, okay, go and check it out and tell me what you think. Well, he called back the next day, overly excited. He said, oh my gosh, it's perfect. I love this about it. I love that about it. The style is great. It's got a great viewing room. It's got a great slumber room. I can imagine using this. Yes, I'm really interested. And so I reminded him, I said, well, remember, if you're willing to sign an LOI, a letter of intent, or a heads of agreement, where subject to me buying it, you will become the tenant, then I'm willing to have a crack at buying it. And he said, okay, sounds good. What do we need to do? Now, I need a lease, right? And remember, this whole talk is about never be the first to name a figure. So if I told him what I want in a lease, then I think I would have settled for 5 years. I would have said, you know what? 5 years sounds pretty good to me. And maybe even if he wanted more, he might have thought, no, 5 years, maybe I'll do 6 years. But instead of saying, I want 5 years, I said to him, well, how long would you like? And he thought about it and he said, you know, I'd like 10 years with a right of renewal for another 10 years. And so that's what we did. We signed it. I didn't haggle on that. Is it? Well, will you do 12 plus 12? We did 10 plus 10. So essentially he signed up for 20 years and he was there for 20 years, by the way. And I probably wouldn't have got that if I'd been the first to name a figure. So this is a crucial thing where you've got to get it out of your head. It's not a game who can get their number out first. You're not showing that you're the bigger boy by saying, well, I need at least 5 years, or I want to get at least $350,000 for this property. No, it's a matter of sounding the other person out. Now, I can see the obvious logical challenge with what I just suggested. And what if the person you're dealing with, the buyer that you're going to buy from, or the seller that you're going to sell to, after you listen to this podcast, it turns out that he listened to the same podcast. And what are you going to do? Say, well, I'm not going to be the first to name a figure. You name it. And he'll say, no, I'm not going to be the first to name a figure. You name it. So obviously there are situations where this won't apply. And you can't take anything in life too literally, because you'll forever be finding exceptions to supposed rules. This is not a rule. It's a guideline. And yes, there will be exceptions. But where the other party doesn't know what's going on, then you'll be so much better off by knowing that by skillfully not being the first to name a figure, that you'll be better off. Now, why do I say skillfully? Is there any skill involved in keeping your mouth shut? It's not quite that simple. Let's look at how long a tenant wants to have as a lease duration. Instead of saying to the prospective tenant, well, I'm not going to name the figure first, so if you would care to tell me how long a lease you want, I can see what I'll count with. That's not what we're talking about. That is not very skillful. That's almost revealing that you're not going to name it, and then he might come back and say, well, I'm not going to be the first one to name it either. And if you can say, listen, my style of real estate ownership is I need it to work for both parties. It's not just a win for me, the landlord, at your expense, the tenant's expense. In fact, the way I see it, we're in business together. And my business of owning real estate is dependent on you, the tenant, doing well. So I'm going to look for things that we can do to make this easier for you and to make it enhance your business. Because if your business is running well and if you're happy doing what you're doing, where you're doing it, then the chances of you renewing your lease go through the roof. So with that in mind, in that sense, could you give me an indication of what would be an ideal lease duration for you? What would work for you? I think that doesn't come across as pushy. It doesn't come across as saying, if you say 5 years, I'm going to go for 10 plus 10, you're coming across as genuine. And indeed, you should be genuine. By the way, all those things I said, where my tenants are my business partners, I believe that. And I manifest that because that's how I operate. I treat them that way because I want them to know that if they fail, if their business falls over, then I don't have a paying tenant. That's usually the only circumstance under which a commercial tenant can wriggle out of paying the rent. That's if their business goes bankrupt, right? So I want them to succeed. And to the extent that I even want to choose tenants that I think have a good chance of succeeding, rather than choosing higher paying tenants whom I think will go belly up after 3 months. So in all those senses, I have a vested interest in keeping this whole machine functioning well and working well. So in that context, I think if you can formulate it properly and ask the tenant in a way that sounds uplifting, how can I make this work for you? What is an ideal lease length for you? Now, if he comes back and says, well, 38 deals is perfect for me, and let's just renew it every 38 days, just because he comes back with that doesn't mean to say you need to accept that. At that point, if someone said that I've never had that happen, that's ridiculously short, and I can't imagine any commercial tenant wanting such a short lease. But even if they said we want a year's lease, I'd say, you know what? I do annual leases or rental agreements on residential properties. But in this particular building here, it's typical in this area, the minimum lease duration is 2 years, if that's what it is. I have a few commercial leases at 2 years. More typically, they're 4 years or 5 years or 6 years. So whatever it is, I'll share that. And if they try to get a 1 year lease and it's typical to have 6 years, I'll say, you know what? I'll consider it, but there's quite a bit of interest in that. And if you're not willing to budge on the duration, then I might be tempted to go somewhere else. Now, it depends on supply and demand. If that's the only tenant you've had come along in 3 years and they're not exactly beating a path to your door, then 1 year at a time might be better than nothing. But I think you get the drift of what I'm saying. There are averages and standards and norms for this. You wouldn't rent your residential house out on a 15-day lease, unless it's an Airbnb or a VRBO, of course. But I mean, on a rental for a family to live there 15 days at a time, you want a year. Occasionally, people do 6 months on residential, but a year is not uncommon. And sometimes at the end of the year, they'll renew it for another year. Sometimes after the first year, it goes month to month because everyone's thinking, well, they're here, they're happy, they've moved in, they're living there. The only thing that's going to change that is if they change their job or they have to relocate for other reasons. And in general, that won't happen. So residential tenants tend to stay for the long term, even though after the first year, they might go to a month-to-month basis. Whereas commercial tenants are kind of a bit different. They want longer-term leases. In fact, The most common question I get from my commercial tenants is, Dolf, can I please get an extension on my lease? And, typically they'll put a number on it. So, Dolf, can I please get a 5-year extension on my lease? And I'll look it up and I'll say, but you've still got 3 years left to run. And they seem to ponder it and say, yeah. Anyway, getting back to the question, can I please get an extension on the lease? And the question I'd pose you is, why do they want a 5-year extension when they've still got 3 years left to run? And it's not because they think they want to run the business for the next 8 years. It's not that. Often, if they know they want to run it for another 10 or 20 years, they will ask for a 5-year extension on a 3-year lease, 3 remaining year lease. But even if they know they want to sell the business in the next 3 or 4 months, they'll try and get the 5-year extension. You never get the residential tenant, honey, we're moving town, we're going to Seattle, let's see if we can extend our lease on this residential property. Of course not. Then they couldn't leave. Why does a commercial tenant request a 5-year extension on a lease when it's still got 3 years to run, and they know that they want to put the business on the market in 3 months? And this is where commercial real estate is so good, folks. And the answer lies in the fact that often the value of a business is dependent on many things. Turnover, obviously, then profit margin, obviously. It's no good having a $4 billion turnover when you're running at a loss. So turnover, profit margin, and the nature of the business. If you make telex machines or fax machines or Walkman or Discman, chances are your business is going down. You're not going to sell many units. You wouldn't sell any these days, except for those interested in nostalgia. Whereas if it's an ascendant industry, something that's up and coming, then that obviously is a lot better. So why do they want this extension? Their business depends on many things. Are they in the right industry? Does it have the right turnover? Does it have the right profit margins? And how long is the remaining lease length? Because if you've got a commercial premise, let's say it's a retail store that's been doing really well, $1 million of profit a year, and they're trying to sell this business for, say, 2.5 times its profit margin. So they're trying to sell it for $2.5 million. And the potential buyer comes along and says, wow, you've been on this location for 15 years. The turnover's good. The profit margin is $1 million. How long is the lease? And you say, well, we've only got 3 months left on the lease. Well, what happens then? Well, we don't know if we can get a renewal. Then the buyer probably won't buy. Because what no one knows, not the current business owner and not the person looking at buying it or the landlord, if they relocate to a new premise because the landlord wouldn't renew the lease, then they don't know how much of that $1 million profit or $2.5 million turnover or whatever it was, how much of that they'll retain. Because very often the value of a commercial business is dependent on the location. All their clients from decades or years ago, whatever the case may be, they know where to go. They don't even know the street address, what number or what street it's on, or the postal code or zip code. They just know where to drive. They go there, they buy their things. Now, all of this, you might think, could be diminishing because of the internet and the fact that we now tend to buy everything through Amazon. Why do I say Amazon and not Amazon-like companies? Well, Amazon's cornered a big portion of the market. They've done something right. And remember, if you find out what people do right, you can take shortcuts. And instead of spending 40 years to find the optimal something, you can do it by listening to podcasts or reading books. And I'm telling you that if you are open to the fact that commercial tenants want long-term leases, then that's good. What's good for them is good for you. Does it make your investment more secure? Of course. Do banks like to lend on successful businesses that have already been there for 10 years and have 8 years left on the lease rather than on a property where the maximum lease term is 1 year and often at the end of the first year it goes month to month? Of course. I know that was a bit of a pitch as to why commercial has some advantages over residential. Listen, residential has some advantages over commercial. I'm not denying that. It's just for most people, once you've acquired 15 or 20 or 30 houses, it doesn't make much sense to buy your 21st or your 31st house. It's very smart to go to commercial. And for some people, it's smart to go to commercial after 10 houses. For some, maybe 5. I know of very few people, not many at all, they've gone to commercial on their first deal. There's nothing right or wrong with any of this. I'm just talking about averages. You'll always find exceptions to the rule. Someone who bought, I don't know, some wacky piece of real estate that's neither residential nor commercial. Who knows? It might be a caravan site in the backwaters of nowhere that they've made spectacular profits from. But we're talking about the law of averages here, because on average, real estate is very forgiving of all its investors. Whatever era you bought, and if you wait long enough, it tends to really go up. You can't always say the same about shares. The shares of companies that made fax machines that we mentioned before, or telex machines, or Walkman or Discman, they haven't always fared that well, because if that's the mainstay of their business and they don't adapt to new technology, then they tend to fall by the wayside. And it reminds me of something that happened to me. I used to shoot these videos called Discussions with Dolf. And there was kind of an interesting thing, because I had over 1,000 subscribers paying $50 a month. It was a lucrative thing. You've done the math. That's $50,000 a month. You can live off that. And then an event happened in the world where my subscriber base over a period of about 6 months went from over 1,000 down to 0. And that event was the introduction to the world of YouTube. Because I'm sure everyone thought, and I don't blame them, why pay me $50 every month for 4 mere videos when on YouTube you can see a lifetime of videos added every day? So it's amazing. Well, when I had this program, Discussions with Dolf, there were no video streaming service the way now you can just shoot a video and upload it straight away to social media. That wasn't possible. I literally had to build my own video streaming service, like the motherboard and the CPU and the box and all that sort of thing, and then get software. Well, I didn't personally do it. I have teams of experts who did that, but software to run video streaming service, so that when I uploaded a new video, which we shot on cameras with magnetic tape, mini DV it was called at the time, and when I uploaded it, an email would be sent automatically to my 1,000 subscribers saying, hey, the latest video of Dolf is available. He's in Kalimantan. I click here to check it out, and they could check it out. And that was kind of really cool. In fact, at the time, from what I gathered, many of the subscribers weren't just there to get the information. That was probably part of it. But a lot of it was, where in the world is Dolf this week? All right. So there was that element that now people aren't that impressed by it, because on Twitter and Facebook and whatever it is, Instagram and TikTok, people are all over the show. And you see the most amazing photos and videos and informational video clips from all these parts. But back then, that didn't exist. I had this program, Discussions with Dolf, went out to 1,000 people, and it was extraordinarily popular. And I used to shoot it. So I did this many years ago. I think it was in the 1990s. And I was in Tokyo one time, and I happened to like a particular suburb called Akihabara, and because that's not only where they have all the latest in gadgetry, and Japan is already at the cutting edge of new innovative technologies, including electronics. So I was on this particular corner where visually it seemed appealing to me. There was an overhead railway line. There was a zebra crossing that was about, 20 yards or 20 meters wide. And there were colored stripes of buildings. And it was just this visually appealing place to be. And in those days, the first time I shot a video in this location, they had a shop right next door to me which sold Walkman. And for those of you who remember, a Walkman was a portable cassette player, cassettes being the little magnetic tape things where you record music, or you could buy pre-recorded music and you'd put it in your Walkman, you'd have earphones in, and you could go around listening to music. Of course, if you wanted 10 artists to listen to, you needed 10 cassette tapes to carry with you. And if you needed 50, you needed 50 cassette tapes, and that was too much to carry. So we all tended to carry 1 or 2 cassette tapes with us. And these things, sometimes the tape would get wound around the casper, and you'd have to use a pencil to undo it. And the quality would go down, and they have what's called wow and flutter, because the motor wasn't always constantly revolving. And when you jolted it, it made noise. Anyway, that was what was popular at the time. And we all had the latest Walkman with the fancy technology to fast forward to the next track or skip 2 tracks or whatever it was. Then I was back in Tokyo. I thought I'll do another discussion of the Dolf video about 10 years later. And Walkman had fallen by the wayside. We had Discman in the meantime, where we had CD players. And CD, if you think, is a laser with 800 nanometer wavelength. I mean, very fine stuff. How could they ever make one that you could walk around with and jostle, and the laser wouldn't skip tracks? But they achieved that technologically. We'd surpassed that. We were now onto MP3 players. This was before Apple came out with the iPod. But anyway, the shop was selling those. And then I was back there just before COVID hit. I think just in late 2019, going through Tokyo, and I shot another video, same location. And now there was no electronic music playing technology in the shop. It was a shop selling anime accessories and things that I haven't got my head around, this anime thing. But in Japan, It is not just a movement. It's kind of a revolution. Everyone's into it, and characters and plastic things. And they were selling that. Nothing right or wrong about it. No judgment on that at all. I'm just saying, whoever devised and invented and put all this brain power into making cassette tape players that had great audio quality, and they kept the wow and flutter to a minimum, and they could last 8 hours on a single AA battery, and all the other things they did to make that technology really state of the art. And it was brilliant at the time, if you consider that not too long before, the only way to listen to music was through LP and LP players, and you certainly couldn't carry one of those on your shoulder and have it play and listen to music without needles jumping around. So the technology that went into that was astounding. But it all fell by the wayside, and whoever invented the Walkman, even if they had patents on them, which they did, or patents, whatever you want to call them, they did not make any more money out of it. And when it went to Discman, the inventors that put time, effort, energy, and brain power into that, they're not making any more money from that. And then MP3 players, no more money from that today. iPods, no more money today. Apple doesn't even really make them. The iPod's included in your iPhone now. And the same goes for the Android and other operating systems, of course. However, and here's the point, the owner of that real estate still made an increasing amount of rental and capital gain on that property every minute of every day of every year. It's just the nature of the tenancy changed. They went from selling Walkman to selling Discman to selling MP3 players to selling iPods, and now to selling anime. And who knows, I haven't been there for a couple of years, 3 years. Maybe it's something different now. But it doesn't matter. The owner of the real estate is still generating income. And other than maintain the building and keep it watertight and do whatever else he had to do, it is still there performing as a great investment as ever. In fact, I can't imagine what the value would have gone up. Like last year, we saw the greatest increases in real estate values, real estate capital values across the world, not just here in the States, in Canada, in France, in Australia, in New Zealand, all over. They've had astoundingly big increases. And some pundits are saying, well, that's because it's time for a crash. And it might happen, guys. It might have started while I was recording this podcast, but I don't think so. And most of the astute pundits who've got a good track record are saying that this year we're not going to see a crash. In fact, values are going to increase further, not quite as much as last year, but still further. So it just goes to show that there are so many different ways of looking at everything, folks. You've just got to have an open mind. And you've just got to know that you should never be the first to name a figure. Read where you can and just understand fundamentally what goes on inside other people's minds, so that if you can negotiate something smartly and figure out what they want, then the sky's the limit. And I love that Zig Ziglarism, which is that you can get whatever you want as long as you help enough other people get what they want. If you can help enough funeral parlor operators get the premises they desire. Because remember, I had to find him. He could have found that building if he'd looked hard enough. But despite the fact that the building had been on the market for 3 years, he didn't find it. I helped him find it. And as long as I could help him meet all his other aims, then he would be a happy tenant. And I asked him, how long do you want? I would have been happy with 5 years. And he said, I'll only do it if you give me 10 plus 10 years. What a dream come true. What a great playroom to play in, where everyone's needs can be met and everyone's happy with everyone else. And that's why, just to finish off, I don't see the real estate game as an antagonistic game between two rivals. I see it as something that can be played by partners where every side benefits. Anyway, thank you so much for watching and listening. Hope to see you soon. And in the meantime, I want to wish you, as always, successful investing.